This story is for the men who were there, not for commentators, not for historians with timelines and charts, not for panel discussions under bright studio lights, not for arguments that have outlived the people who once shouted them. This is not about policy, not about speeches made in Washington, not about flags raised or lowered. It is about 19, about boots that were still stiff, about hands that had not yet learned how to be steady in a jungle. If you were there, you already know. You don't need me to explain the heat. You don't need me to explain the sound a helicopter makes when it's not part of a movie. You don't need me to explain the way a letter from home feels heavier than your rifle. You remember. You remember how young we were, how our voices still cracked sometimes when we laughed, how some of us needed to shave only every other day, how we tried to stand a little straighter when the older guys looked at us. We weren't symbols. We weren't headlines. We weren't lessons in a textbook. We were boys who had just started to figure out who we were, and then we were sent somewhere that didn't wait for that process to finish. This story isn't here to reopen wounds, and it isn't here to close them either. Some things don't close, they settle. They rearrange themselves quietly inside you. They become part of the architecture of who you are. If you were there, you understand that memory is not a straight line. It's not chronological. It doesn't obey decades. You can be 75 years old and still be 19 for a moment. All it takes is a smell, a certain kind of humidity in the air, the rhythm of distant blades cutting through the sky. This series is not about who was right. It is not about who was wrong. It is about who stood beside you, who shared water from the same canteen, who whispered where they were from in the dark, who laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't that funny, who walked ahead of you on a narrow trail, who walked behind you, and sometimes who didn't walk back. If you were there, you know the difference between history and memory. History is printed. Memory is carried. History debates. Memory endures. This is for the men who carried it. The ones who came home and didn't talk about it. The ones who talked about it too much. The ones who still wake up before dawn without knowing exactly why. The ones who never quite got used to fireworks again. The ones who built quiet lives afterward. Worked jobs, raised children, sat in bleachers at Little League games, paid mortgages, mowed lawns, and still, somewhere deep beneath all of that, remained 19. We are not here to argue. We are not here to judge. We are here to remember, to sit in the silence long enough for the past to step forward gently, to acknowledge that once, under a different sky in a country far from our own, we were young, and we were there. This story is for you. The aircraft door did not burst open dramatically. It unlocked, it shifted, metal against metal, a dull mechanical release. For a second, nothing happened. Then the heat entered. Not like a breeze, not like summer back home. It didn't rush in. It pressed in. A thick wall of air pushing through the narrow opening as if it had been waiting outside the entire flight. You don't see heat. You feel its authority. The first breath was wrong. Your lungs expected something dry, something neutral. Instead, they filled with air that felt already used, heavy, moist. carrying scent and weight and something alive inside it. Someone behind me muttered, "Jesus." Not loudly, just a reflex. The metal floor beneath our boots had been cool inside the aircraft. Now, even before stepping out, you could feel warmth rising through the soles. Sweat didn't build gradually. It appeared instantly at the base of the neck, behind the knees, along the spine. You didn't earn it. It claimed you. The sunlight hit next. Not golden, not soft, white, wide, blinding in a way that erased detail. You squinted automatically, but squinting didn't fix it. It was as if the sky had been turned up too high. We stepped toward the opening one by one. 19-year-old bodies wrapped in fabric that had been packed and folded and issued far from here. Boots that had walked American soil just days earlier. Helmets slightly too large. Faces still adjusting to the idea that this was not training. The first step onto the metal stairs was steady. The second felt different. By the third, you understood that the air itself was something you would have to carry. Each inhale dragged against the chest, not painfully, but insistently. Humidity isn't something you see. It's something that attaches itself to you. It slid under the collar, settled in the hollow of your throat, collected at the wrists. The straps of the pack, already tight, began to feel closer. Not because they were adjusted, because the body was reacting. A thin film formed across the skin in seconds. It didn't evaporate. It stayed. In Indiana, when you sweat, a breeze eventually finds you. Here, the air did not move for your comfort. It moved when it wanted to, and even when it moved, it was warm. The smell reached you halfway down the stairs, fuel first. Sharp, industrial, familiar, then something beneath it. Wet soil, green growth, vegetation thick enough to hold moisture long after rain. And underneath that, a sweetness that wasn't entirely pleasant. Decay, not rot, not death, just constant transformation. Leaves falling and breaking down. Water sitting where it shouldn't. Life feeding on life. You didn't have language for it yet. You only knew it didn't smell like home. Home had seasons. Home had winter that cut clean. Home had air that could be cold enough to hurt. This air didn't cut. It enveloped. By the time your boots touched the runway, your shirt was already clinging to your back. The fabric darkened in patches. Your hands adjusted the strap of your rifle. The metal was warm, not hot enough to burn, just warm enough to remind you where you were. The runway shimmered. Heat rising visibly from asphalt. The horizon blurred at the edges. In the distance, palm trees stood in a way that didn't resemble any tree from the Midwest. Their shape alone told you this was somewhere else. You didn't need a map. You didn't need coordinates. Your body knew. Somewhere behind the glare, voices carried in a language you didn't understand. Quick syllables, rising and falling tones. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't welcoming. It was simply unfamiliar. And unfamiliar at 19 feels larger than it is. The sweat reached your eyebrows and gathered there. You blinked it away. Your heartbeat was steady, not racing, not calm, just aware. That awareness was new. At home, air was background. Here it was foreground. Every breath required acknowledgement. You tried to take a deeper inhale. It didn't satisfy the way you expected. The lungs filled, but the relief didn't come. Humidity doesn't give relief. It gives presence. Someone ahead of me stepped off the last stair and paused for half a second too long. A sergeant behind him tapped his shoulder. "Keep moving." The words weren't harsh. They were efficient. We formed a loose line on the tarmac. Helicopters sat in the distance, their blades still. Even motionless, they looked restless. The sky above them was enormous, not because it was different in size, because there was nothing familiar to measure it against. No church steeple, no water tower, no grain silo, just sky and green and heat. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. The sweat returned immediately. There would be no staying dry here. Dry was no longer the goal. Endurance was. At 19, discomfort feels temporary. You assume the body will adjust, and then everything will level out. You assume adaptation is quick. What you don't understand yet is that some climates don't just surround you. They enter you. The heat moved inside. It slowed your thoughts slightly. Not enough to dull them. Enough to thicken them. You found yourself focusing on small mechanics. The sound of boots hitting metal stairs, the click of a sling adjustment, the distant hum of engines. Detail replaces overview when you're overwhelmed. A bead of sweat ran down the side of my face and into the corner of my mouth. Salt. Immediate. Human. Proof that this wasn't a dream. We had trained in warm weather before. We had marched in summer, but this was not heat as an event. This was heat as a condition. Permanent. The kind that does not wait for sunset to retreat. Someone laughed nervously. It sounded too loud in the open air. The laugh died quickly. There is a particular kind of silence that forms when a group of young men are trying not to show discomfort. No one complains, but everyone adjusts. Straps tightened, helmets shifted. Canteens checked. You take a sip of water. It is already warm. Not refreshing, just functional. You swallow anyway. The sun climbed higher, even though it had already felt high. Shadows were short, sharp. The ground seemed closer to the sky than it should be. Distance compressed. The air did not carry coolness from anywhere. It carried weight. A breeze moved across the runway for a moment. It did not soothe. It wrapped. It felt like someone exhaling close to your face. You realized something then. The heat did not care how old you were. It did not care where you came from. It did not care about confidence or fear or doubt. It treated everyone the same. It pressed against your chest and waited to see what you would do next. 19-year-old bodies stood in formation, trying to look older, trying to look unaffected, but the sweat betrayed us. It traced down temples, soaked collars, darkened waistbands. You could see it on everyone. Shared discomfort becomes a kind of bond. No one needed to say it. We were all being claimed by the same air. A truck engine started somewhere nearby. The sound vibrated faintly through the ground. The vibration felt closer than the sound itself. Even noise behaved differently here. It didn't travel the same way. It seemed to hang for a second longer before fading. A man 2 spots ahead of me adjusted his helmet again. The strap stuck briefly against damp skin. He pulled it free. The small irritation looked larger in that moment, because everything physical was magnified. The body was learning. The body was recalibrating. You don't remember anyone giving a speech. If there was one, it dissolved in the glare. What I remember is the realization that there would be no pause, no acclimation period. This wasn't a swimming pool you dip a toe into. It was immersion, immediate, total. The heat did something subtle. It erased the last layer of distance between you and the fact that you were no longer home. Cold air on the plain had allowed a thin illusion to remain. Stepping into this, that illusion evaporated faster than sweat ever could. Your breathing slowed intentionally, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Control what you can, even if it's only rhythm. The jungle beyond the runway looked dense enough to swallow light, green layered over green, shadows beneath leaves that hid whatever they wanted to hide. The air between here and there shimmered, not dramatically, just enough to remind you that visibility was conditional. You wiped your hands on your pants. They were wet again seconds later. This was the first lesson Vietnam gave. Not about combat, not about survival, about environment. About surrendering the idea that comfort was a baseline. About understanding that your body would always be slightly taxed. Even at rest, especially at rest. You shifted your weight from one boot to the other. The asphalt radiated upward. Heat from above. Heat from below. Suspended between two pressures. At 19, you think pressure builds slowly. Sometimes it arrives all at once. No one said welcome. No one needed to. The heat had already done it. It wrapped around us without ceremony. It did not threaten. It did not promise. It simply remained. And as we stood there, squinting into the white horizon, sweat tracing lines down faces that had barely begun to age, we understood something without saying it. Whatever we had been before stepping off that plane, that version would not remain untouched. The heat had touched us first, before the jungle, before the patrols, before the gunfire. It pressed against our chests. It filled our lungs, and it stayed.